And welcome to Healing X Outreach. I'm your host, Augustin Estacio, and just want to welcome everyone to today's program. We have a very special guest on today. But before we go ahead and go into the program, I just want to announce that song is by Sarah Groves. It's called Generations. I think it's a very apropos song, especially in this time and age. And I love what she talks about the resurrection, and I think those are very important doctrines that we really need to hear more about in music today. We have on Tuesday, Melissa Bramer is back. She's going to be doing Hurting the Healing. And so if you want to tune in on something in the middle of the week on Tuesday at 7:30 Eastern Time, Melissa Bramer is going to be having a special guest, and just tune into her program. Her ministry is Genesis5020ministry.com. And her radio program right here on the Healing Outreach Network is Hurting the Healing. So tune into her at 7:30 p.m. every second and fourth Tuesday. She's back on the air. She was doing retelecasts for the summer, and so now she's back doing live broadcasts, and we welcome her back. Today's program, we're going to have Dr. Michael Heiser. He has a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic languages, and we're going to be discussing really three very important topics. One is specifically important to you if you are an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and if you are an ex-Jehovah's Witness who is a Christian and has encountered ex-Jehovah's Witnesses or current Jehovah's Witnesses on the issue of the doctrine of the Trinity. Today's program is very important because, if you're on the video, one of the other ways that people do listen, and just want to give everyone clarity, there's three ways to listen to today's program. One is the number. This is a Blog Talk number, which is 347-934-0379. The other is the Sixth Screen Telenetwork number, which is at 712-432-8710. And when you dial in, when you dial into that program, that number for the Sixth Screen Telenetwork line, you need to dial 9925. So just letting them know in the video suite, and we do have a video suite, which is another way that you can participate, is the video suite is sixscreensofthewatchtower.com. Go in there, and there is indication to get into the video suite, and there's a chat room. And all right, normally I have my mic off, but I guess I turn my mic on. Can you hear me now? Just making sure that Rick has everyone who's able to hear me, because normally there's an echo. All right. Okay, good. All right, so then people can hear me in the video suite, and I don't hear an echo, so that's good. That's good. So, all right, everybody's on the same page now. This is what happens when you have 3 formats for the same program. So we have a video suite and chat room, and if you want to submit questions to Dr. Heiser, who we have on today, you can submit either, of course, by unmuting yourself on the Sixth Screens line, which is hitting *1, and that line is 712-432-8710. And the other one is to press 1 when you are on the Blog Talk line, which is 347-934-0379. Or if you're in the video suite chat room, you can go and submit your questions through the chat room. I'll tell you, Dr. Heiser has really hit on 3 subjects close to my heart. We're going to discuss all 3 of them today. We have an action-packed 2 hours. And one of them, first of all, is very pertinent to Christians that are going to be dealing with Watchtower apologists. It's going to be pertinent to those that are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that have become Christians. And it's also going to be pertinent towards ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who handle ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who hold on to Unitarian theology, monotheism, and the like. So without further ado, I wanted to welcome Dr. Heiser. Dr. Heiser, if you are on the air, and I know that you had heard the music, please hit 1 so that I can see you, unmute you on the program screen here. And let me make sure that I am, yeah, there you go. There you go. Okay, great. That's, that is, that, all right, let me just refresh my screen real quick so I can make sure I got everything current here. Just give it a second. It's refreshing. All right, there we go. Hello, Dr. Heiser, you're on the air.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you loud and clear.
Well, that's good. That's a little weird. I hit 1 earlier, and then I guess it didn't take, but second time's a charm, I guess.
Yes, the second time is charm. Let me just let everyone know a little bit about you. That Dr. Heiser has a podcast, and I've subscribed to it. It's called the Naked Bible Podcast.com, and you're going through the book of Ezekiel, I think, on that podcast. At least the few that that are through the book of Ezekiel. And so I would really encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to the Naked Bible Podcast. He also has a couple websites which are going to deal specifically with today's topics. And what I love about what you have done, Dr. Heiser, is that I think you know that these are very distinct topics, and so you've developed websites for each particular topic. And so he has a website called thedivinecouncil.com, and we're gonna be speaking a little bit about that today. Well, actually, a lot about that today. And there's a lot of great information on thedivinecouncil.com, and there's also a website for a really kind of offhand topic which a lot of people don't discuss in theological circles, or at least don't specialize in, which Dr. Heiser has actually developed for a particular topic and concentrated on. It's called peeranormal.com. Peer, anormal.com. And so I'm excited that you as a scholar have decided to delve into the whole Nibiru, Zechariah Sitchin genre, which is really largely been unaddressed, but has a huge following today. And so, but before we go into what is probably considered kind of an off-topic, I do want to discuss what I had read. I spent the night reading one of your articles on the Divine Council, and it's a topic that has come up greatly. We've had several debates here on Healing X Outreach, largely between a Catholic Trinitarian and many different Unitarians that are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that have retained their henotheistic views. And so what you delve into on the issue of Elohim, first of all, I want if you could explain for our audience concerning the term El and why that's important as far as being the name of God and origins. Because you went through I guess it's called the Ugarit. And I'm actually unfamiliar with the Ugarit. I'm not sure if that's the same thing as El discussed in the Akkadian civilization. And for those that are listening, the Akkadian civilization is possibly the second oldest civilization known to man, next to the Sumerian civilization. So does the Ugarit have any affiliation with the Akkadians or Sumerians?
Only the script, the style of writing, the characters, that sort of thing. That style is a better way to put it, because Akkadian and Ugaritic, even though they're both cuneiform scripts, the languages are quite different. We should back up on one point for your listeners. The Paranormal is a podcast where we review peer-reviewed literature on all sorts of paranormal topics. We're 4 episodes in. The 4th one hasn't been posted yet. But the Sitchin stuff they can find at sitchiniswrong.com. It's
Oh,
Sitchin, then is wrong. But we'll get to that, I'm sure, later. Um, Back to the Divine Council stuff. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the website. Thedivinecouncil.com. That is my website for this topic. And you're right. I have tried to create some specific websites for specific topics. If listeners go to thedivinecouncil.com, it's just a one-page site with links out to different papers, and some of them are academic papers. Those are typically published peer-reviewed articles, and then there are, I guess I hate to call them non-academic because they're sort of academic, but they're not full of footnotes and all that kind of stuff. It's not
right.
scholarly writing that you'd submit for peer review. When you brought up henotheism, which again I'm sure we'll get to, but if your listeners are really, I would say gung ho, or
Yeah.
really kind of invested in that topic, if you go to thedivinecouncil.com, about three-quarters of the way down on the right hand column, there's a link to an article called, the label I gave it here was Monotheism and Divine Plurality in the Old Testament, and it has academic in parentheses. That's a peer-reviewed article, and I discuss henotheism on a page or two of that. So now to your actual questions. Yeah, Akkadian and Ugaritic are different. They both, like all Semitic languages, have the word, il or el, which is a generic term for deity. Any deity in those languages. Now, at Ugarit, El became a proper personal name for the, ostensibly the head of the pantheon. And so you'll see El as the head of the Canaanite or the Ugaritic pantheon as a proper name. El doesn't actually run the show. He has a second in command who does everything, and that's Baal in Ugaritic religion, Canaanite religion. But in the Hebrew Bible, since they also have the term El, again, general word for deity, there are places where El is used also as a proper name for Yahweh, the God of Israel. And Yahweh is a distinct deity. Yahweh is not found at Ugarit or anywhere else as a deity name. There years ago, maybe, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years ago, there was a scholar in the field of Israelite religion who thought, he could show that Yahweh showed up in Ugaritic text, but that has since shown to be a misreading of a tablet or two. So Yahweh is pretty distinct, and Yahweh is called El, or the El, Ha-El in Hebrew. In other words, the biblical writers are positioning Yahweh, asserting Yahweh as the true high God in their, in the Hebrew Bible and of course biblical theology.
Now, the reason why I asked because I know in the Akkadian civilization, El was also known as one of the pantheon of gods that they had worshipped. But you go into great detail, like El, I guess in the Ugarit pantheon, actually had a wife.
Yeah.
He had a wife, and I was reading your paper last night, and so I guess this fits in with, and I think you made the association in the paper about Abraham being called out by El, of course, and I guess it was being called out from the a religious polytheism, so to speak.
Yeah, it's really, I don't want to be pejorative here, but there, on the one hand, it, to someone who's just jumping into this stuff, it kind of looks like a mess. Everybody's talking about El, okay,
Right.
or Elohim, or it's just, and it's like, well, how do you sort all this stuff out? On the other hand, if you actually take the time to read, the serious literature, not like amateur internet literature on this stuff, in other words, let's graduate from Wikipedia and worse when we do this sort of thing.
Right.
if you do that, well, it does have an order. Abraham is referring to you know the the deity who contacted him, who spoke to him and made
Right.
a covenant with him. That's my El, that's my God. Well, of
Right.
course it is. I mean, we can use that term now, my God, and I'm not referring to Allah or Vishnu or whatever. In other words, there's a context for all of this kind of language, both in terms of where you find it in the Bible, and also, again, just the broader context of who Abraham was, where what his status is in terms of the biblical history and whatnot. So you can't just start plucking out terms and proof texting verses and say, aha, Abraham was this. He was a polytheist or a henotheist. Well, you kind of got to look at the full orb, the full spectrum of biblical theology before you can start talking about what Abraham thought or didn't think.
Yeah. The reason why I'm particularly interested in your paper on the divine council, and I'm sure there are many other papers at divinecouncil.com, but is because one of the arguments that I've encountered with Unitarian apologists, particularly those that have come out of the Jehovah's Witnesses and still retain their Unitarianism, is that, of course, Elohim being a divine counsel, and applied in, I think, in Psalm chapter 85, which you take note of.
Psalm 82, which is a fundamental text. Yeah.
Well, and I think you have an interesting story behind that. The fact that your interest actually came by giving that text of scripture while you was in church by, I guess, a fellow, a friend of yours in church.
Yeah.
I
I talk about this in my book, The Unseen Realm, and that, again, listeners need to know what the unseen realm is and what a site like divinecouncil.com is. What I'm giving you, what I'm trying to give people who are interested and motivated enough. That's a nice way of saying not lazy. Motivated enough to actually go look for good material. Everything I'm saying in these sources has passed peer review. Okay, I'm not an amateur. And I don't mean to degrade, people who are really interested in biblical text. I'm trying to find you because, you're kind of the hope of the church, if you're really interested in this stuff. But, you have to realize, again, I've been through the ringer here. I've jumped through the whole dog and pony show of graduate school and getting the PhD and all that kind of stuff. I know the lay of the land. I know the languages, and I submit my work to peer review. I don't just post stuff hoping that other scholars won't see it. Okay, I want them to see it, and I want it peer reviewed. So this is what you're getting when it comes to this sort of stuff. And so while I was in graduate school, to get back to the story, I'm sitting there killing some time before church, like we're used to doing, and I don't remember the conversation I had with this guy. He was a colleague in the Hebrew Studies department there at Wisconsin, but I'll never forget the way it ended. He hands me his Hebrew Bible and says, "You need to read Psalm 82, but this time in Hebrew." And I mean, I had taught, on the college level for 5 years. I've got 2 master's degrees. I'm sitting there in a doctoral program in Hebrew Bible, but I had never read Psalm 82 in Hebrew. And so I did. I sat there and I read it, and it's not a difficult verse. The first verse is the one that kicks you in the teeth, if you're not used to seeing this stuff. And it's not a difficult verse. It's Elohim Nitzav Ba'adat El, God, and it has to be singular there, capital G, because Nitzav is a singular verb form. It's a participle. So God has taken his place, or is taking his stand in the divine council. Very straightforward. Then the next line of the verse is Bekerev Elohim Yishpot. In the midst of the gods, in the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. It has to be plural because of the prepositional phrase in the midst of. You can't be in the midst of one. And we don't have the Trinity here because if you read verses 2 through 5, God is really ticked off at the other Elohim, and he's calling them corrupt and wicked.
Right.
Okay, this is not Trinitarianism here. It's God, the God of Israel, speaking to a group of Elohim they're called the divine council. So the term just means the heavenly host, the assembly, the divine beings that work for God, or ostensibly supposed to be working for God. And what really, what kind of freaked me out at the time, and what creeps other people out, and that I've come to understand why this is, because of the way we're trained to think in Christian theology, in church, and whatnot, really in Western civilization, is that when we see the letters G, O, and D,
Right.
we mentally, our brains just immediately assign a specific set of unique attributes to those three letters, G, O, and D. That's why it creeps us out when you put an S on the end of it. Well, you can't put an S on the end of it because, God has all these unique attributes. There can only be one omnipotent, one eternal, one, sovereign, all that kind of. But the biblical writers did not think of the word Elohim the way we think of the letters G, O, and D. And you say, well, Mike, how do you know that? Are we just supposed to take your word for it? No. No, if you have software, you can search it and find the results in about 1 second, but then it might take you a couple of weeks to go through them. But I've already done that. I'm telling you what you're going to see anyway. Elohim is used of half a dozen different, catch this, different entities. Now, that alone tells you that the biblical writer is not assigning a specific set of attributes to the word. If he was, he wouldn't be using it of 6 different things.
Right.
So right away we see, okay, Elohim to a biblical writer is not quite the same as God is to us. They didn't think about that term the way we think about God. So I mean, it's very easy to demonstrate this. You got Psalm 82:1, Elohim used of the gods in the heavenly host. The Elohim in the heavenly host, well, they're distinct from this other Elohim. So there's a distinction there. We've got Deuteronomy 32:17, the Shadim. Most English Bibles translate that demons. They're called Elohim, okay, in Deuteronomy 32:17. We've got gods of the nations called Elohim. We've got, the angel of the Lord called Elohim. We've got we've got in 1 Samuel 28:13, we have the disembodied dead Samuel. The spirit of Samuel is called Elohim. Now, again, if the biblical writer's doing this tells you they don't think of a unique set of attributes accrued to this term. What the term actually means is, and the reason why it's used of all these different things, is that you would use Elohim to describe a being, okay, or beings who are by nature disembodied and they live in the spiritual world. So in that spiritual world, Yahweh is part of that world. Okay, the God of Israel is part of that world. So Yahweh is an Elohim, but for the biblical writers, no other Elohim is Yahweh. Yahweh gets described in unique ways in other verses. He's described as omniscient. He's described as the creator of all the other ones. He's described, as the sovereign of everything. Omnipotent, omniscient, all these traditional ideas that we get from Christian theology. But those ideas, those attributes, do not derive from the word Elohim. They derive from descriptions in the Bible scattered in a bunch of places. So you go back to Psalm 82. I mean, when I first saw this in Hebrew, I didn't know any of that. And I looked at that and I thought, my first thought was, wow, that looks like a pantheon.
Right.
And then fortunately, I had a subsequent thought where it hit me that, I'll bet Jesus knew this verse. I'll bet Jesus had read Psalm 82. I'll bet Paul had read Psalm 82. I'll bet the apostles knew this passage. So this can't be a pantheon like we think of it. So what is it? Because their theology doesn't reflect, you're like a pagan polytheistic system. So
right.
how do we approach this? And that was the beginning point of my own, personal pursuit. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't have any help. I mean, I went to evangelical sources, I went to evangelical commentaries, and they avoid this like the plague. Or they make up dumb views like, oh, the Elohim of Psalm 82, they're just people. They're just men. They're just Israelite judges. Well, that doesn't work because 7 Psalms later in Psalm 89, we have the same council terminology with the holy ones. They're called the sons of God there, the B'nai Elim. And that matters because in Psalm 82 and verse 6, the Elohim are called the sons of the Most High. Look, there's only one Most High, folks. And in Psalm 89, that means the B'nai Elohim are in this council again. And the kicker is, in Psalm 89, the council is, quote, in the skies. Okay, it's in the heavenly realms. Now, the last time I checked my Bible, and frankly, reality, there aren't a bunch of people ruling the nations, ruling up there with God. They're not floating around in the sky. So this idea that the Elohim of Psalm 82 are just people is just absurd. It doesn't account for very transparent passages that contradict it. So I had to struggle, through this whole thing, and it became the focus point, one of the focus points of my dissertation. It was just one of those things that I remember distinctly, thinking about all of this, and again in the process of discovery, thinking, you mean to tell me that I have to rethink something like, monotheism, how we talk about that, like I got to do all that over again, and I just wanted to quit, and it's like, no, I can't let this go. This has an answer, even though I'm not finding it. I know again, Paul knew this passage. The apostles knew this passage. I didn't just find something that no one had ever seen. So I've got to tackle this. We have to resolve this issue. And once I did, the Bible frankly just came alive for me. When I started to force myself to think not like a traditional Western Christian, but as an Israelite, as a worshiper of Yahweh, and saw how that bled into the New Testament and was applied to Jesus. All sorts of things just opened up. And again, I recommend Unseen Realm. The reason I wrote it was to get this all on paper, so that people who care, about the biblical text can read it. I mean, I'm a very traditional Trinitarian. I'm a very traditional, monotheist in the sense that Yahweh is unique. Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. That's what Abraham would have thought. If you'd have walked up to Abraham and said, "Hey, Abraham, are there other Elohim out there?" He'd say, "Well, duh, of course. Like the whole spiritual world's populated with them. Where have you been?" And then if you followed that question by saying, "Okay, I get it," but so Yahweh's, Yahweh and these other Elohim, they're all kind of the same. They're all kind of the same guys, right, on the same level. Abraham would probably just punch you in the face at that point. If he had a rod, he'd probably beat you over the head with it. Because that would be the offensive part. Taking away from Yahweh's uniqueness.
You gave several classifications for Elohim, and I think that's really important. You will find that the listening audience that I have here is very interested in these topics, specifically because they're relevant towards many of the people that do listen that are former Jehovah's Witnesses. It's relevant towards them personally, theologically speaking. One of the books that I've read is a book by Daniel Boyer, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with his writing. He's an Orthodox scholar from Cal Berkeley.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book called The Jewish Gospels. And one of the things that in my apologetic as a Trinitarian Christian I've had with basically ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who now actually the Jehovah's Witnesses would never claim that they are henotheists. They would claim that they are monotheists. They are strict monotheists, of course. But many that escaped from the Watchtower Society and still embrace Unitarianism have actually now embraced that the Bible is henotheistic. Guys like Brett Stafford, who has written a book called Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, an answer to scholars and critics, and many others that I've encountered have now embraced this idea that the Bible is actually a book that is henotheistic, and one of the apologetics that I've always maintained, of course, in defending the doctrine of the Trinity is Jesus' uniqueness, and that henotheism downgrades Jesus to a creature amongst creatures, albeit chief of creatures, but just in title alone, not by nature, and therefore making him not unique. And my appeal has always been to Psalm chapter 86:8, and I know you're very familiar with that. You covered it in your paper, and I'm sure you've uncovered it in your book, Unseen. What was the title of your book? Unseen Realm.
The Unseen Realm.
The Unseen Realm. That's a book I'm definitely going to have to purchase. So, and of course, Psalm 86:8. It says that there is none like Yahweh, YHWH, the divine name is there amongst the gods, the Elohim, or the sons of the heavenlies is one translation. And so my defense has always been, of course, Jesus is unique. He is unique because Hebrews chapter 1 referenced him as unique amongst the angels. But you said something interesting in the paper that I read, is that that the reference towards Elohim doesn't necessarily involve angelic beings. It's not specific to them.
There's not an overlap in terms. Malachim, Hebrew term for angels, and of course angeloi in Greek, angels. They are Elohim in the sense that they are disembodied members of the spiritual world, but the terms are not synonymous. Angel, malach, angelos, it's basically a job description. In other words, it's a term that describes what a spiritual being does, not really what a spiritual being is. It's not ontological, it's functional. So it's a messenger. It's a particular Elohim that takes a message. That's what it is. That's the service they render to God.
And I've never thought. I've always thought of classification as far as beings in heaven being they were all either angels, seraphim, or cherubim, and then there's God. But I think you highlighted that there are other beings that may not necessarily be angelic, like the four elders. They're distinct beings, and so there are.
Yeah, you really do need to read Unseen Realm. But I will say this: with your specific context with the Jehovah's Witnesses thing, I want you to remember to send me an email after we're done.
Okay.
Because I will. I have a journal article appearing. Well, it actually just did appear, but it won't be. Journal articles don't get put out on the internet. They're not publicly accessible. You have to be near a library that subscribes to whatever journal it is, and then you can get it.
Right.
But I will send you that because it's really deals with half of my dissertation. That Canaanite religion was used to having El and Baal, a two deity system. Okay.
No.
Where El was the real sovereign, but Baal was the chosen one to be the vizier, to actually run everything. So you have this sort of two-tiered, two-deity El and Baal thing. Now, Hebrew Bible scholars have known for many years that both El and Baal terms and El and Baal descriptions, epithets and descriptions, are applied to Yahweh, because the argument has always been, well, the biblical writers are saying, well, we don't believe in El or Baal. We believe in the one, God, Yahweh. And so Yahweh sort of absorbs their attributes, to try to make this theological point. And all of that's true. But what they've missed is that the same thing happens with a second Yahweh figure in the Old Testament. Okay, I have lectures out on YouTube, on my websites. If you go to twopowersinheaven.com, there's a lecture there that I've done. What you have in the Old Testament is you have two Yahweh figures. You have the antecedents to a Godhead. Judaism used to teach a Godhead, and I'm sure you know this if you've read Boyarin,
Yes.
because Boyarin's big on this, the two powers in heaven thing, that used to be orthodox theology in Judaism until the second century. Alan Siegel was the scholar who wrote a famous book on this in 1977. He just recently passed away. But his book is called The Two Powers in Heaven. Well, they get that. Siegel, in his book, sort of had this intuition about where it might have come from in the Old Testament, but he never really said anything about it other than I have this intuition. Well, that became my dissertation. Where does this come from? And so what you have is you have a visible Yahweh figure who often comes in the form of a man, appears as a man, and then you have an invisible Yahweh figure, the one that's transcendent in the heavens. They're distinguished, but yet sometimes they're put in the same scene, and they're both referred to the same ways. And in fact, in some passages, and one in particular, Genesis 48, they're actually fused together. So the reason I'm saying this is that what the Israelites did was instead of saying there's two separate deities that run everything here, a father and a son figure, they would say,
Right.
okay, yeah, there is a father-son figure, but they're both Yahweh. That's how they handled it, and that's how they expressed it. And that language gets attributed to Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus gets the labels that the second Yahweh figure, the human Yahweh figure of the Old Testament, he gets those labels assigned to him. And there's the name, there's the word, there's the one who rides the clouds. There's a whole list of these things in the Old Testament.
Right.
It's a deliberate strategy on the part of the New Testament writers to make sure that we know that Jesus is now the incarnate form of this number two Yahweh in the Old Testament. So, the number two Yahweh is but isn't Yahweh. It's the same way we talk about Jesus. Well, he is God, but he's not. He's not the Father, but he's God. So this kind of thing. This is Hebrew. This is Old Testament theology. This is not something that Christians invented. And the reason why that's significant for henotheism is henotheism's fundamental assumption is that none of the other gods is the top one. They're distinct. They're always separable, and the one that's at the top can be toppled, can be removed, can be replaced by one of these other ones. But they're never thought of as the same being. They're interchangeable, but they're not the same. Well, that is not what both testaments of the Bible say in relationship to the Old Testament Godhead and, of course, Jesus.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's one of the, Jehovah's Witnesses, like I said, are not henotheists, but been an uprising of henotheists that have left the.
Let me ask you a question.
Uh-huh.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
No, I think I know the answer to this, but you're going to be an authority here. Is it true that a Jehovah's Witness would never think of Jehovah as an angel?
Absolutely. They wouldn't think Jehovah as an angel.
Okay. Well, your listeners need to go to Genesis 48. Okay, Genesis 48 is, I actually used this the last time a Jehovah's Witness came to my door, and I'll describe the reaction to it. But this is not in the script. Okay, this is not something that they're going to see coming at all. Genesis 48 is Jacob's blessing of Joseph's children. It's a familiar Sunday school story where Joseph brings the kids in, and Jacob crosses his arms, and Joseph tries to correct him, and then he gets rebuked, and that's the part we know. But we don't pay attention to what Jacob says, and especially in Hebrew. So here we are, Genesis 48:15. He blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked." Now, the God there is Ha Elohim, okay, the Elohim, okay. The Elohim before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. Again, we know who that is. Second stanza, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. Another occurrence of Ha Elohim. The third stanza, you would expect it to be the God again, but it's not. It says, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. And here's the kicker: bless the boys. Bless in Hebrew is grammatically singular. So you cannot translate this, may they bless the boys. It's may he bless the boys. It's singular. That fuses Ha Elohim and Ha Malach, the God and the angel. And of course, the angel here, if you go back in the biblical storyline with Jacob, is this angel of the Lord character that we're going to see. We've seen him before. We're going to see him again.
Right.
And he's going to be again identified as Yahweh in other ways. But here you have a textual, grammatical union. If the writer wanted to make sure that we knew they were separate entities, that we wouldn't get confused, you would use a plural form. But
Right.
he doesn't. And
Oh, yeah.
you know, I showed that to the Jehovah's Witness, and it's the first time I've only had maybe half a dozen conversations with them, but didn't know what to say. Just totally flabbergasted. But then you know, you get back on script and so on and so forth. But I'm you know, and I prefaced our conversation with that question. Now, you don't think Jehovah's an angel, do you? So you take him to this, and you say, well, either Jehovah's an angel, and you're wrong, or this particular angel is God, is Jehovah.
Right. Yeah,
you know, you got two choices.
They have difficulties with the Christophanies in the Old Testament. I think I've read Rabbi Arnold Futtenbaum's, and I think he started Ariel Ministries, his article on Jewishness and the Trinity, which is, you can find that on any Chosen People Ministries website, any Jews for Jesus website. But
but this is also a denial of this denies the fundamental premise of henotheism.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you say that, oh well, God and the angel, they're both God, you know, because that's the implication here. Then you start tracking on the angel, and that's going to lead you to Jesus. I mean, it's a trap, but it's not, again, a New Testament trap. It begins in the Old Testament, and that's usually where people aren't looking.
Now, in the paper that I have from DivineCounsel.com, you did mention something that caught my attention, because Boyarin, in his book The Jewish Gospels, actually indicates that within Israel they may have had several different views about God, and that is the premise for him saying that Nicene Trinitarianism may have been one of those views amongst Israel, and he uses, of course, the book of Daniel as his premise as far as Jesus being the Son of Man, a title of deity, which he believes is a stronger implication of Jesus' deity than the term Son of God, actually. Now,
I would agree with him too.
Yeah, you actually used the term that really caught my eye, and that was an Orthodox Israelite. So
yeah.
So when I read that, you was saying that this is what an Orthodox Israelite would view this particular passage or this particular term, that made me automatically think, well, that means that there were Israelites that were not necessarily Orthodox in the camp of Israel, and that goes
academics.
That goes
Academics will. I mean, Boyarin's looking at Judaism, you know, as really a Second Temple period, intertestamental period, you know, post-exilic phenomenon. And you know, he's right. You know, that Judaism of antiquity is just like Christianity of today. There's lots of varieties. They don't all look at everything the same way. Like, wow, what a discovery, what a shock. You know, it's the same thing. And if you move further back into the biblical period, Orthodox Israelite is a distinction from, of course, heterodox Israelite. There were lots of Israelites. We actually just hit this in the podcast a week ago. for instance, Ezekiel chapter 8, 8 and 9 was the episode. There were Israelites worshiping the sun, thinking they were worshiping Yahweh. It's a clear denial of the prohibition in Deuteronomy 4, 18 through 20. This is not what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to worship the celestial, objects or beings or whatever as like you do Yahweh. You only worship Yahweh. But they thought again that they were doing that. Well, God really didn't care. He was still angry. But that's a point of heterodoxy. The whole Asherah, El has a wife at Ugarit. Her name is Athirat, which is Asherah in Hebrew. That creeps into Israelite worship. So they're still thinking that what we're doing here is that ought to be okay, because our El, we have El and they have El, and their El has a wife, so why can't ours? They're blurring these sorts of things, and then you have the prophets running around saying, no, 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 no. That's why they diss Baal. That's why they diss Asherah. They're trying to correct this, but you have a lot of heterodox worship and theology in the Israelite community.
Yeah. So and that's really enlightening. That's something that I never really thought of as a Christian. That the diversity that we see today within Christianity, and as you said, not everyone is Orthodox, would exist. I think I think we've made an assumption, at least I have.
Well, if you think about look at their situation. Because we all have Bibles, we think that's the way it's always been.
Right.
None of these people have Bibles in the biblical period. Sounds kind of crazy, but they don't. Yeah. Most of it hasn't even been written yet. And what has been written, you don't just send it off to the printer and then mass produce the thing. Nobody has a Bible. So it's the responsibility of the priests, and in the biblical period, you don't even have synagogues. That's an exilic phenomenon because of the absence of the temple, and the priesthood, and all the sacrifices. So that the priests are somehow supposed to communicate truth to the people, and oftentimes, it takes the form of the calendar, the festivals, and whatnot. But really, the whole learning about Yahweh, you're almost entirely dependent on passing down theology from house to house, family unit to family unit. It is nothing like we have today where we can actually just go read the biblical text, look something up. They didn't have that. So it is a free for all. And I mean, honestly, you'd expect that.
That's really interesting because, and what's amazing is that even though we do have the written text, we still have a great deal of, heterodox views within Christian circles. There are people that may be Orthodox in some respects, and yet in other respects. And just this whole year, I've been concentrating on the bodily resurrection because I've been shocked and surprised to see how many Christians, and we're talking about
how many Corinthians we still have,
that have no idea what the bodily resurrection is about. And so I would imagine, I mean, you make a great point in that at a time when there was no written word and where the word was transmitted orally, largely, it would possibly be even more of a mixed bag. One of the things that, and I'm a Reformed Christian, and one of the things that I do like about some Reformed circles is the liturgy, and liturgy, of course, is really just the oral transmission of the word. What Catholics call oral tradition is liturgy. Gregory put it to song, and what Gregory did and put it into song was not that much different from its Jewish precedent, because the Jews teach through the Hallel. They put their prayers into song, and they teach through song. And so Yeah, I've never really thought. I think we've always made this assumption that uh, the Old Testament Jews really had it together. I mean, it was either this was the true God, and everybody else just was put to death. you know, as if there was no conflict within, and not necessarily conflict in a negative sense. What I mean by, diversity as far as opinion as to who God is or how God works in Israel. And what you and Boyeren have done is really open a huge door of perspective that I never really thought about. But it actually helps bolster the defense of the Trinity, I think, in light of the view that I used to have, as far as that I used to view that the Old Testament was, definitely Trinitarian. Is just it was hidden Trinitarianism, and that even though the Jews were, and I had this position that the Jews were no doubt monotheists in the sense they only believed the Father was God, and that was it. They were strict monotheists. Now that might not necessarily be the case. I always felt that they were strict monotheists, and that it was the New Testament church that opened the doors to a monotheism that involved a plurality of persons. But that's not the case now.
Yeah, I would recommend that you again send me an email. And I'll send you what I can here. But Siegel's book, The Two Powers in Heaven. Again, he was a Jew all his life. His book is about how the belief in two powers, two good guys. This isn't dualism here. Two good Yahweh figures. That was perfectly acceptable in Judaism until the 2nd century AD, which of course not coincidentally coincides with the rise of Christianity. But how that became a heresy. That's what his book's about. How Judaism declared one of its own points of theology a heresy. So it's fascinating. The other book that I'd recommend is to read Benjamin Summers' The Bodies of God. And what he does is he shows that the idea. Are you familiar with that?
No.
The body. It's kind of an odd title, but what he does in the book is he shows that the idea of God being more than one person simultaneously is not only a Hebrew idea. He teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Okay, he's a Jew. He says this is not only a Hebrew idea, an idea that's defensible from the Hebrew Bible, but he goes back into other ancient Near Eastern texts to show that, well, this isn't anything really new. This idea of a deity who can simultaneously be in different places and be different persons, but still be the same deity, is a very ancient Near Eastern thing. So you got the henotheists running around, and you got people who want to call this polytheism running around, and they're about 5 millennia too late. Okay, they don't have a command of the primary sources, and frankly they just haven't even looked. Now, I'll give them some credit. Maybe they don't know about Summers' book. Maybe they don't know about Siegel's book. But if they do, then they should be ashamed. And if they don't, well, then they need to do some work. They need to stop parroting modern talk, modern Western talk about these ancient texts. It's not only unfair, it's incorrect. So it's time to fix that sort of thing. But I can send you a lot of this stuff, and so you don't forget the titles or anything like that. Yeah, I can send you a bunch of stuff.
Great. I would definitely be interested in reading those two books. The two heavenly powers. I take it that's probably a play on in Genesis and also the book of Amos 4:11, where it talks about Yahweh rained upon Sodom from Yahweh of heaven.
Those were important texts to the Jewish two powers thinking, and God referring to God in the third person. which is known as Iliism. I mean that's part of it, but the two powers idea does not depend on third person references, but they're part of what Jewish scholars, Jewish thinkers noticed, and so out of that went into the blender, so to speak, and out came the two powers idea.
Yeah, and I think I'm familiar with some of that in the like I said, I read Fartenbaum's Jewishness and the Trinity, and he goes into a great deal of Christophanies. We hear about Jacob wrestling God, the Manoah, and the angel of the Lord, who has his name, the ineffable name in him, and they actually possibly worshipped this God by setting the fire and I think they had burned an offering to this God that came before Manoah. So I mean, I think the third person speak is in the book of Isaiah 48, where it speaks of I sent Yahweh speaking, saying I sent Yahweh to and the spirit of Yahweh, which I think shows all three persons in Isaiah 48.
And if you compare Isaiah 63 to Psalm 78, you're going to get it too. You pardon the pun, but if you triangulate between those two passages, you're going to get three. But like we read on the podcast, we just went through Ezekiel 8. The episode on chapters 10 and 11 hasn't uploaded yet. But if you just read Ezekiel 8 through 11, I challenge your listeners, keep track of the divine characters. It's not easy, and it's deliberately not easy, because in chapter 8, the famous vision, let's just start in chapter 1. You've got Ezekiel's vision. You've got this platform atop the cherubim, and on top of that is a throne, and you have a divine man. It's very clearly God in human form. In chapter 10, the person, the thing on the throne, let's put it that way, the divine man on the throne is called the glory of God. Okay, so now we've got the glory of God seated on the throne. Well, when you get to chapter 10, you have the glory of God seated on the throne. Okay, but the vision is about the glory of God back in Jerusalem. So, okay, we got the glory of God who's in human form, riding around on the Merkava throne. Okay, and then you got the glory of God in Jerusalem. And then in the vision, they meet at one point, because the glory above the cherubim in the temple moves out, joins the cherubim throne. And of course, the Spirit's in here too, because the Spirit is the one moving things around. And you have the divine man, picking Ezekiel up by the hand. I mean, the anthropomorphic language. So the question is, how can you have the glory in two places? And, because they're both God. It's the glory of God. Well, if God's over here, how can he be thousands of miles away in Jerusalem? So and it's more than just omnipresence, because one of them is in human form, the other one is not. And then later, again, I guess it's a two-seater. The Merkava, the throne chariot's a two-seater. But you get this sameness, but yet distinctness going on. It's the same kind of thing. And then, you throw the Spirit in the mix. But, yeah, just read through Ezekiel 8 through 11 and see if you can keep track of them. Because they're like the writer never bothers to parse out where they're all at and how and why. Because it doesn't matter. They're all God. They're all Yahweh. So what does it matter?
Right.
Again, this is Old Testament theology.
And that's when I come across such passages, I do realize how Nicene Trinitarianism fits in perfectly with it. It absolutely makes sense through the Trinitarian.
You can see how they would have. Right. They're looking at the Bible, and they're not like, let's impose a theology we like on this thing people call the Bible. Okay, Emperor Constantine, is that okay? Again, that this dumb conspiratorial view. No, they're looking at it and they're struggling with it and they're trying to describe what it is they see. And out comes this, okay, there's three, but they're also one. And if they're one, then they have to be eternal. Okay, we can't claim to really comprehend that, but that's what we see. That's what's
I
there.
think Justin Martyr in his letter to Trifle is the first one to really dig deep into Old Testament Christophanies. And ironically, he's speaking to a Jew about Jesus in the Old Testament, and I think that's where, if any of the Antennicene fathers we were to read, that's where we would get the fullness of Jesus being God in the Old Testament, and the Christophanies, and also his appearances as far as the angel of the Lord. Now, I do want
just so your listeners. Just let me add one more thing, quick. Just so your listeners catch this, you can't say, "Oh, well, okay, Justin Martyr. Well, he's a Christian. Of course, he's going to say that this is what the Old Testament says." Stop right there. This is why Boyerin's work is important. This is why Alan Siegel's book is important. They are not Christians. They are Jews.
Right.
Benjamin Summer is not a Christian. He's a Jew. Christians are not making this stuff up. They are observing what other Jews of their day thought was completely normal. Nowadays, that isn't the case, but then it was. This is not a Christian invention.
Ironically, the person who had referred Boyerin's book to me, and I haven't read his book, was Michael Brown. I had Dr. Michael Brown on the podcast 4 years ago, and he says you have to read Boyerin's book. He didn't, and he had already written. I think it's called the Jewish Jesus. I think it's his book, which I haven't purchased that book, but it's on my Christmas list. But when I read Boyerin's book, I was like, wow, this is from, and not a conservative Jew, not an Orthodox Jew who is teaching at Cal Berkeley in a secular institution. And so I was like, for this to come from an Orthodox Jew, this is really a landmark book. It is, because for the longest time, I have had these, and what I mean arguments, not arguing arguments, but I've had these arguments as far as apologetic defense of the Trinity, using ancient rabbis who, in the Zohar, second guess themselves and saying we're sounding like the heathens. When let us make man in our image. Let us not talk, comment on this anymore because we're starting to sound like the heathens. Speaking of Trinitarians, of course, and most of the henotheists that we've come across here would say, well, this is Zohar, it's not a really serious work, or it's post second temple Judaism. But here we have an Orthodox Jew commenting on Second Temple Judaism, saying that Trinitarian Christianity is well within the range of Second Temple Judaism. And so I just think that it's a landmark work. There's some questions that some of the listeners have typed in the chat room, and they wanted to get your viewpoint on some of these things. Bridget says, what is Dr. Heiser's opinion of the book The Jewish Trinity by Noel Natan? I don't know if you've read that book.
No, I haven't read it, so I don't know.
Yeah. And the other question she asked, what did Jesus mean at John 17:26? I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known. Jehovah's Witnesses say this means he wanted them to know Yahweh or the name Jehovah. Right.
Yeah, something they could have just looked up because it occurs like 2,500 times. I mean, just imagine this. Okay, so here we are. Jesus shows up, and he's in a room full or whatever gathering of Jews and says, "Okay, everybody get ready. Here's why I came. Everybody be quiet. I have a big announcement to make. Your God's name is Yahweh. Thank you. Thank you very much. My work here is done." It's like, that's insane. They knew that. They had Exodus 3. They have the Hebrew Bible by that time, even in translation. They've got Targums. They've got the Septuagint. Everybody knows what God's name is. What it means is it goes back to something in the Old Testament called the name theology. That's an academic term. But Exodus 23 is a fundamental passage where God says to Moses, "Hey, Moses, I'm going to send an angel ahead of you, and he's going to get you to the promised land. And you better pay attention and listen to him." This is Exodus 23:20 through 23. "You better listen to him because he won't pardon your transgressions because my name is in him." Now, in the Torah, this theology, again, scholars call it the name theology, is reflected in a lot of places. God telling Moses, "My name is in this angel," is the same thing as saying, "I'm in this angel. My presence is in this angel." How do we know that? Well, we know it because of the way God talks about the name elsewhere. He refers to the promised land in Deuteronomy over and over again as the place where I will put my name, or the place where my name shall dwell. And he's referring to when you get in there and you build a temple, this is where my name is going to be. I'm going to place my name in, so on and so forth, this central place of worship. If you go through the Torah, just ask yourself this question, then go through the Torah and answer it. Who brought the people out of Egypt and took them to the promised land? What you're going to find is some verses say Yahweh, it'll use the divine name, YHWH. Other verses like Deuteronomy 4:37 will have the presence, Panim, bringing them out and taking them to the land. Others will have the angel, okay, doing this. And some will have Elohim, God. So, oh, Mike, I'm so confused. Who brought the people up out of Egypt and took them to the promised land? Which one of the four is it? The answer is yes. It's all of them because they're all the same.
Yes.
And then you go to the New Testament and you got one place in Jude where it says that Jesus brought the people out of Egypt, and you have Jesus saying, Father, in John 17, the high priestly prayer, I thank you because of the name you gave me. I kept them in the power of your name. I came here so that they would know, your name. Basically, he's not saying, boy, I'm thankful that you didn't call me Elvis, that I was named Jesus. Thanks for giving me a name that sounds kind of good. That isn't the point. Giving Jesus the name is a way of saying that, you are in me. You're with me. It's a way of self-identifying, with this. To reveal the name, to keep people by the power of the name, is to reveal God. God is the name. The name is given to Jesus. Why do you think at the end of Revelation, Jesus comes back, and there it is on his thigh, the name that is above every name, and, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, right there on the thigh. Jesus is identified with the name is the short answer, the short version. And the name is God. Jesus, this is another way, this name talk is another way of identifying Jesus with the God of Israel. Fusing them together, when you see one, you think of the other. That's the New Testament strategy. When we talk about Jesus, you need to be thinking about God, because we're going to link Jesus and God all over the place, all different ways. Again, it's not Jesus saying, "Hey, I got big news. The name of your God is Yahweh." Like, duh. What do you think? We're all just illiterates here? That's just absurd. It's really, it's just, it's really bad.
We have a caller who has a question for you. All right. Caller 250, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning. It's morning where I am. It's just a little after 11. Good morning to everybody.
You're where I am.
Yeah, I'm in British Columbia.
Oh, I'm in
Oregon, I guess.
Washington.
Oh, okay. I have in writing here, you wrote, "We must never, not for a moment, forget who we are in Christ and what that means to the world. I would just like to thank you so much for showing up at this time in my life, being a teacher for God, a teacher God intended for you to be.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm glad I was useful. Really.
Thanks. I'm an ex-JW. I've been out of that organization now for 8 years. I was in for almost 26 years.
Wow.
And and I immediately went and bought all your books, all of them. Gus, you may not know that Dr. Heiser has a question and answer companion to the Unseen Realm. You might want to pick that up. I'm into, I dare you not to bore me with the Bible. Fantastic. He's got a book called Supernatural. He's got 60-second scholar, 100 insights that illuminate the Bible. He's got another one, 60-second scholar, 100 observations on Bible doctrine. And another one, 60-second scholar, 100 maxims for mastering of the Bible study. And I also bought that 2 Powers in Heaven. So I'll get to all those books in due time. I will.
Good for you, really.
I promise.
So let me just share something. Dr. Heiser, the caller that just called in is the reason why I had you on today's program.
Oh, really?
Barbara.
And for listeners, we are in a different location. This is not my wife.
No. She's in Canada, but she has taken an interest in your teaching, and she asked me about your teaching, and then I went on the website and I was like, oh, this is really interesting stuff, and so I was like, oh, I got to get him on the podcast. So Barbara, the one that personally responsible to getting you on today.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to say I'm simply hungry for the type of church that God intended us to experience. I really am. You know, the church that reflects our God and his kingdom. It's certainly not the JW cult. It is not. So may I ask you, Doctor, what church you attend? Is that
I go to, I go to Grace Church in Bellingham, which is very eclectic. It's officially a non-denominational church. The pastor there is a guy named Dax Swanson. I'm it's going to sound funny, but I'm allowed to teach there. I mean, we can laugh about that because of the nature of the subject matter. Dax was a former medical doctor, Princeton grad, really bright guy, very teachable and very, secure, in his theology, loves to learn. And that's really what you need. You need to find a community and a pastor that, the person is the leadership's not so insecure that they will refuse to keep learning and take some advice and direction from people in the congregation. I don't know that that's the norm. It probably isn't. Sad to say, everybody. We live in a culture where I guess this is sort of necessary. Lots of church leadership, if they care about doctrine, they tend to be sort of in defense mode all the time because there's so much strange stuff, floating out there on the web. So I understand that on one level, but if you came to Grace Church in Bellingham, I mean, Dax is not doing divine counsel stuff over the pulpit. He will interject it occasionally, depending on the passage, because he's read the book. We've known each other for 8 years, that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a unique setting. We have had people leave because I said this or that thing, or they found my website or something like that. But that has never jeopardized our relationship. I'm actually an elder there, so it's kind of a unique situation for me. But you find somebody that again is not so uptight about their status within a denomination,
right,
or their status among their own peers, but that is really committed to taking people to the text. That when I preach a sermon on Sunday, you should be able to follow the content in the text yourself. try to find something that's textually oriented, and then again, people who want to have genuine relationships too.
Right. When you were talking about Genesis 48, Jacob's blessing of Joseph's children, and you said Jehovah's Witnesses won't see this coming. Well, that caught my attention. Is Jehovah an angel? I thought, and then you explained this and that, and how the he makes it singular, so it views the angel as Yahweh. And I automatically thought of Jesus being Michael the archangel, because that's how the Jehovah's Witness thinks. But yeah, okay. So is Jesus this Yahweh mentioned in Genesis 48?
Well, I think the way I put this is that the second Yahweh figure of the Old Testament is the second person of a three-person Godhead, the second person of the Trinity. Now that second person will become eventually in the New Testament will become incarnate in this person we know as Jesus Christ. So they're two different things. Embodiment in the Old Testament, God appearing as a man. Again, that happens a lot. But embodiment is still different than incarnation. So, and I don't get too uptight over people saying this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. I mean, I know what you mean by that. And theologically, I'm not going to get bent out of shape over that. But if we're talking about the man, the man born to Mary, Jesus of Nazareth, well, when he gets born, that's when he's born. But I know what you mean by this pre-incarnate, kind of talk. But the way I think to be technically more precise, we have the second person of the Godhead, who really his job seems to be to appear and interact with people as a man. And then this second person, will eventually become incarnate, pass through the birth canal, the whole bit, of Mary, and be a human, be a genuine human, and live and die and rise again, in Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay, one short little question here. Is the Ezekiel 8 podcast going to be posted soon on your site? Like
8 and 9. Yeah. Oh, the transcript. Boy, we forgot to mention it. The guy who does the transcripts is no longer able to do them, so we're looking for another transcript person. So the short answer to the question is I don't know when transcripts are going to start again. But the episode itself is there. And then the one we just recorded one yesterday, 10 and 11, that is not uploaded yet.
Oh, what about 9?
8 and 9 were together.
8 and 9 were together. Oh, okay. 8 and 9 were together. And then 10 and 11 was just, okay, great. I usually print off the transcript and then listen to you guys on the podcast. But okay, I'll listen to the podcast. No big deal. Thank you again.
Well, we are trying to fill the void. It was unexpected, but it'll get filled at some point. We'll get caught up.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah. Transcript writing is really tough. I've done it before. It's attention to detail. So I can understand that.
Yeah, you can only automate it to a certain extent. You still have to have the human eye.
Fine.
Go through the thing.
Now, I do have I have one more question related towards Elohim, because you mentioned that Elohim. I don't know if that's a general application that applies to those in the spirit realm, but Jesus in John chapter 10 mentions the Pharisees and talks about unrighteous judges. Of course, when they say, you yourself claim to be God, being a man, and then he makes the reference towards the Psalms, where it makes reference towards basically to unrighteous judges, human judges.
He quotes Psalm 82 verse 6.
Yeah.
Now, Jesus does in John chapter 10.
So then wouldn't that be the exception if it's talking about human judges?
No, it's not. I mean, let's hold on one second here. I'm going to get the passage here.
Psalm 82:6.
Yeah, but I'm actually specifically looking for something in particular here.
Oh, okay.
Just to make a point for your listeners here. The word judge or judges never occurs in John 10. So even the way you asked the question reflects something that you've heard or read before.
Yes.
That you sort of assume is in the chapter, but it actually isn't. Okay, Jesus is not talking when he gets into this conversation with the Pharisees or the Jews there.
Right.
They're not talking about judges, and neither is he. I mean, he has this, verse 30. I should mention before we get started, if your listeners go to the podcast, nakedbiblepodcast.com, episode 109 is devoted entirely to this question. So
okay.
nakedbiblepodcast.com, episode 109, and with 109, people will be able to download some slides of a presentation I did on this at a church. So you can get something to look at and then listen as well. But let's go back to John. So here we have in John 10:30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And the Jews are angry with him. Verse 31, they pick up stones, to stone him. And then he starts to defend himself. And in the midst of that defense, he quotes Psalm 82, verse 6. And then if you keep going in John, you get to around verses 37 and 38, Jesus makes another statement. He says that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So verse 30, you have a claim of equality with God, which is why the Jews are angry. I mean, that's the way they take the statement. I and the Father are one. They say, this is blasphemy. We're going to stone you. And then in verse 38, he says it again. The Father is in me and I'm in the Father. That goes back to the angel and the name language of Exodus 23, which we just talked about. That God is in, this figure, this second, Yahweh figure. So the question becomes, well, in between those two pretty clear statements of equality with God, and again, that's the way the Jews take it. In between them, he quotes Psalm 82:6. So the question becomes, do you think Jesus would quote that to defend his claim or to undermine it? You say, well, Mike, that's a dumb question. Well, I ask it that way because basically every commentary that you're going to find on the Gospel of John will assume that the Elohim, the gods of Psalm 82, and Psalm 86, says, I said you are gods, Elohim. God is speaking to the members of the council. Every commentary will assume that he's talking about people, human judges.
Right.
Okay, this kind of thing. Well, so in other words, Jesus has said, I am the Father are one, and then he sees the Jews around him picking up stones, and he says, hold on, guys, hold on. Doesn't your own scripture say that you guys get to be called Elohim too, right? So, don't pick up stones and stone me. What I just said about myself, you can say too. Really? Is that really what he's saying? He's backpedaling. He's backpedaling on his claim to be equal with God. He must have forgot it. Jesus must have had a short memory because 2 verses later he's saying, oh, the Father's in me and I'm in the Father. He's not saying that at all. So this assumption that the Elohim of Psalm 82 are men actually undermines Jesus' own claim in John 10. And what I'm saying is, if you think that's what Jesus is doing here, that's really absurd. It not only gets the Psalm 82 wrong, but it has Jesus contradicting himself and backpedaling and saying, hey, you guys can call yourself this too. We're kind of all the same here, brothers. That is not what he's doing, and it's not what John does consistently in the Gospel of John. What he's really doing is, if you have to go back to Psalm 82. When he quotes this, and verse 6 is the one that has the Elohim as the sons of the Most High, he's really doing two things. One is he's saying, look, guys, scholars, don't you recall back in Psalm 82 that terminology of divine, of sonship, being a son of God, sons of God,
Yeah.
That doesn't apply always to people. In fact, I would say Jesus is denying what basically most commentators think he's saying. I think he's specifically denying it. He's saying, look, I know you're used to this Son of God terminology of the King and other people, even the nation of Israel, Exodus 4, let my son go into the desert to worship me. But don't you remember in Psalm 82, there's this psalm where the same terminology is used of divine beings? Do you recall that? So the first thing Jesus is saying is, look, when I use this term, there's scriptural precedent for me referring to myself this way and claiming to be more than a man. Your own scripture uses it of beings who are more than men. They are divine. So that's point number one. Point number two, he finishes off that when he says, I'm in the Father and the Father is in me. He is claiming, he is using Torah language to associate himself with Yahweh, who is Lord of the council. So he's not saying, I'm just like you guys, you're just like me, we're all one big happy family. Okay, it's not, the ancient Jewish Barney song. Okay, that's not what Jesus is doing. He's saying, I am more than a man, and your own scriptures allow me this terminology to make that point. But I'll go even further, dudes. Okay, the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. I am Lord of the council. Okay,
Wow.
he defends his deity. This is a defense of deity, not a backpedaling or excuse making on the part of Jesus. But again, if you can find a John commentary that lands there, please let me know. I mean, there are a number of commentaries, scholarly commentaries, that will give you, the divine, what I call the divine view of Psalm 82. But none of them land there because they're all used to essentially quoting each other on this point. They'll say, what about Exodus 18? What about the appointment of the Jewish elders? Well, if you go to Exodus 18, guess what? The judges there are never called Elohim. Okay, you can do like many translations do, just capitalize God. The passage makes perfect sense. Again, I have whole articles on this Jewish judges question. There is no text that there's no text that calls judges Elohim. Period. There's also no text that clearly makes that connection. But it's a traditional argument invented within the Jewish community to get away from divine plurality that has been perpetuated by Christian commentators, most of which are New Testament guys who are not familiar with the divine council stuff at all because they're not Old Testament guys. They weren't trained in a Semitics program. They never run across it. So I'm not here to beat up on them. That's just sort of the way it is.
Dr. Heiser, but in Psalm 81, verse 7, it says, but you die like men, and like one of the rulers you fall. And
Psalm 82.
Yeah. In verse 7.
This is a big theme. This is a big theme in Old Testament theology. The death of the gods. Okay. So God is telling, verse 6, go back to verse 6. Yeah, I said, again, God's the one speaking, you are gods, Elohim, sons of the Most High, all of you. Okay, and if we go to Psalm 89, the sons of God are again in the heavens. They're not people. And there's lots of sons of God references elsewhere. Okay, nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. So there's an obvious contrast here. He's speaking to divine beings and saying, I'm going to take away your existence. Your life is contingent upon me. And of course, the reason for that is he's the one who makes all things in heaven visible and invisible, blah, 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 blah. Again, we're familiar with the theology. It's very familiar theology. The death of the gods is really an important thing. Back to Naked Bible Podcast. So episode 109 was on John 10. Okay, so if your listeners want to go to that, again, I recommend they do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for another episode number. I think it's 90. Oh, I just went the wrong way. One more click here.
Yeah, I'm gonna go.
I'm on my podcast site. All right, episode 95. Episode 95. I interviewed a guy named David Burnett, who's a doctoral student, a friend of mine, and the whole topic is resurrection and the death of the gods.
Wow.
And we talk about Psalm 82 in the Septuagint because at the very end of the psalm, it's just fascinating, where the psalmist pleads, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." Again, if you're familiar with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of the Old Testament, this is God reclaiming the nations for himself. The word "arise" there is the resurrection verb. And so we in the Septuagint.
Oh, wow.
So we talk about the connection between the resurrection and the reclaiming of the nations. And to reclaim the nations, you have to displace the gods ruling over them. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9. God just divorces the nations of the world at Babel. He assigns them, allots them, to the sons of God. He allots the sons of God to them. It's Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 17, Deuteronomy 29. Again, a whole chain of thought here that if people have the unseen realm, I spend several chapters going through this. But the reclaiming of the nations is linked to the resurrection. And to reclaim the nations as Yahweh's own, you must defeat the gods. Okay, you must displace them, destroy them, so on and so forth. And this is a progressive process. Isaiah 34 talks about the same thing. This is a progressive process that began with the resurrection and will culminate at the end of the book of Revelation when believers, those to him that overcomes, I will put them over the nations. Remember Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 when the Corinthians are bickering with each other, fighting about, financial loss and taking each other to court. He says, don't you know, 1 Corinthians 6:3, don't you people know that you will judge the world? Don't you know that you will judge, rule over angels? Don't you get it? Okay, his point is that, look, in the end, at the day of the Lord, this is Isaiah 34 now, that part of the death of the gods. And all you have to do is ask yourself, when are the nations finally reclaimed? Well, they're reclaimed at the day of the Lord. This is standard Old Testament theology. In the end, when the nations are brought back into the fold, and they're being brought back now through the gospel, Pentecost, gospel going to all the nations, the list of nations in Pentecost in the book of Acts corresponds to the nations in Genesis 10, the nations that were disinherited. All of these connection points are deliberate. They're not accidental. This is biblical theology. This is the epic narrative of biblical theology. And since the nations are under dominion of hostile divine beings originally placed there by Yahweh who went into rebellion. They became corrupt. They seduced Yahweh's own family. The whole biblical story. For those nations to be reclaimed, those gods must be defeated, and they finally will be at the end, the day of the Lord. When they are removed from the nations, they are replaced by us, believers. This is why believers are called the sons of God. This is why Jesus presents us in Hebrews 2 to the council, to the congregation. Okay, this is the great cloud of witnesses. That's also Old Testament talk for divine council and its members. All of these threads, converge at the end of the day of the Lord, where we, Christians, believers, who are now partakers of the divine nature, but we will be made like him, and we will rule and reign with him. Revelation 2 and 3, Jesus quotes a messianic psalm and applies it to us. Okay, we are the reconstituted divine council, and we will rule the nations and defeat the gods.
That was the next association I was going to think, that it was probably an association of theosis. And
it is. It absolutely is.
Yeah. And I never read verse 8, but I think that really puts it together. What you mentioned about verse 8, that Jesus is the risen God.
Here's the thing. I'm not here. I want people to read my book, but I'm not here to promote a book. But I will say this about the book: the dirty little secret.
Promote your book.
Okay, the dirty little secret of Unseen Realm is that nothing in the book is unique to Mike. Nothing in the book just popped out of my head. It is all peer-reviewed scholarship. And what the book does is the book collects the pieces of the mosaic and puts them together for you. Because what I want is I want the Israelite living in your head. I want the first century Jew living in your head, living rent free, in your head, so that when you read the Bible again, and I like to say you'll read it again for the first time, you will be able to see what I describe as sort of a content matrix, a matrix of ideas. You will be able to see the interconnections of all these things. And the reason that we can't often nowadays is because the church spends a lot of time parroting its own tradition, taking weird passages and stripping the supernatural out of them. In other words, reading them like the writers didn't intend them to be read. And so we can still get the true gospel, we can still get the major points of theology, but you lose the interconnectedness of the supernatural epic that is the Bible. And so that's what I'm hoping people get. And you can do this. Okay, you can do. There's nothing super duper about this, that it's unattainable stuff. If you're patient, I can give you the lay of the land. I view Unseen Realm actually as the starting point for all this kind of stuff. But I can give you the lay of the land. I can show you the tapestry. I can show you the interconnections. So that when you read through your Bible, lots of Christians know little bits and pieces of theology, and it's good theology, but they don't know how it all fits together. That's what's missing. So that's one of my ambitions in my academic purpose for doing what I do.
Let me invite some listeners to call in, Dr. Heiser. But yeah, I never read the last verse of that chapter, and that really puts it together. And for those who when I said theosis is actually a Greek Orthodox word to basically say what happens to Christians when they go to heaven. We become partakers of the divine nature, and the relevance of what Dr. Heiser is uncovering is the fact that theosis exists throughout the Old Testament also. That is that when God makes reference to us to the Elohim, we're partakers of the divine nature.
If you think about what Eden was, the divine heaven coming to earth, humans being part of that.
Yeah. The number for those who are listening, if you want to ask a question with Dr. Heiser, because we're down to the last 17 minutes, we're probably not going to get into the other topics. This has been a meaty discussion. If you are on the Six Screens, and you are on Six Screens hotline at 712-432-8710, you can unmute yourself and just hit *1, and you can unmute yourself and ask any questions. But if you are on the Blog Talk line at 347-934-0379, I want you to press 1, and then I'll be able to unmute you. So we have a caller calling in right now. 250, you're on the air.
It's me again, Gus. I'd just like to quickly ask Dr. Heiser, could you please recommend an Old Testament commentary written by a scholar, maybe yourself, that I could and everybody else could read this Old Testament through Jewish eyes or Jewish thinking, so to speak?
Boy, there really is no one commentary that's going to do that. I'm going to cheat a little bit here and recommend that people go out to the web and look up, just Google Faith Life Study Bible. It's something free that you can download to your desktop or your phone or mobile device. It's a study Bible that was created by the company I work for, and I wrote the notes to the Torah. Okay. And I also wrote the notes to Psalm 82. I cherry-picked some other important passages, but that's at least a starting point. It's not a scholarly commentary. It's a study Bible, but it's got 2 or 3 million words in it, There's lots of sidebars. I wrote about 40 of the sidebars about these sorts of topics. It is a great entry point for people for this kind of stuff, and it's free in digital form.
And then where do we go from there?
I would say from there, I would read Unseen Realm. If Unseen Realm is a book, for people who have experience reading academic material.
Mm-hmm.
It's an academic book, but I've got almost 300 reviews on Amazon, and they're very high reviews. They're occasionally I get somebody who I frighten. You get one of those, but the thing about it is, it's very readable. The reviews will say, "Oh, I was a little nervous about an academic book, but wow, I can actually understand this." So I had a really good editor. It's very readable. So I would be, if you are used to Bible study, read
Mm-hmm.
that. Again, that will give you the lay of the land. If you're talking about a person that's new to Bible study, then I would start with Supernatural, and then graduate to Unseen Realm, and then use the footnotes in Unseen Realm. Because I will reference commentaries there. I will reference, journal articles, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be where I'd start.
Right. You also mentioned, Brock. Is it Brock? Is he a biblical comment? Oh, I can't remember his name.
Dan Block.
Is that it? Oh, it's Block.
Yeah,
it's Block.
Yeah, Dan. In the Ezekiel series, I've been referencing Block's commentary on and off, and another guy named Taylor. Dan Block is a friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
We don't agree on all points of Ezekiel when it comes to divine counsel stuff, but he's a wonderful guy. He invited me to read a paper at this year's annual Evangelical Theological Society meeting on the divine counsel and the Pentateuch. So we're not adversarial in any way, but we'll have points of disagreement. But he's followed the work a lot, and I think he has adjusted his thinking on certain points. But he's a wonderful guy, and that's a very technical commentary, though. So again, if you went to seminary, if you're in grad school, you'd like something like that. But I think generally, for people, if you want a reasonably deep commentary on any given book, the NIV application commentary series is probably pretty good. We use a lot of that in classes I teach for undergrads and beginning seminarians. You don't have to know Hebrew to use it. But the NIV application commentary series would be another next step.
Yeah, I also have, I guess his name is Moshe Greenberg.
Yeah, Greenberg was a critical Jewish scholar. By critical, I mean not really theologically confessional in any particular respect.
Well, as I'm going through your podcast, I'm reading what he has to say on each chapter. So, well, thank you so much for your help.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, talk again. Bye-bye.
Dr. Heiser, was it that you was making reference to the Jewish Study Bible? I think I have it's called the Complete Jewish Study Bible. I think I have that one. And they have also a New Testament and Old Testament commentary. Is that what you were?
Yeah, that's not what I was referring to.
Okay.
Ours is called the Lexham Study Bible.
Okay.
You could also Google Faith Life and then Study Bible, and you'd find it.
Okay.
The Jewish one is a little more recent, and I think that only exists in print. But it's going to be broadly Jewish perspective on stuff. It's not going to, unless Benjamin Summer and Daniel Boyarin wrote some of the commentary on key passages, you're not going to find Two Powers Divine Counsel stuff in there.
Right.
They're going to try to steer away from it because of the divine plurality stuff in mainstream Judaism.
Right. Okay, we're down to the last 11 minutes of the program. So if you want to ask a question, just press 1 on 347-934-0379. And we did have someone in the chat room ask a question, and I was giving some I made some commentary on it, but I'll give this to Dr. Heiser. Somebody was asking about why is the devil not mentioned more, why is Satan is not mentioned by name in the Hebrew scriptures except for Job and a couple times in the Minor Prophets. And they wanted to know why are disasters and bad things attributed to punishment from God, but yet in the Greek scriptures, as in the New Testament, there's a great deal of trouble attributed to the devil.
Well, there's some pretty sweeping generalizations in there.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
It's not that the New Testament never has God judging anybody. When Jesus returns, for instance, he's not coming back blowing kisses. The divine warrior stuff of the Old Testament is attributed to Jesus in a number of New Testament books, like Ephesians and of course Revelation. Let's go back to the devil Satan issue. The term Satan in the Old Testament is not a proper personal name. Wow. So Satan, capital S, properly speaking, the name, catch what I'm saying. The use of that term as a proper personal name is not something in the Hebrew Bible. I know it gets translated that way in English Bibles, like in Job 1 and 2. But it's not a proper personal name because Hebrew in Job 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3 and other places appends the definite article to Satan, ha-Satan. The definite article is the word the. In other words, Hebrew is like English. We don't prefix the word the to a proper personal name. I'm not the Mike. Okay, I always say the exception here is Donald Trump. He gets to be the Donald.
He's the Donald.
Right, but that's not normative, okay? So Satan is not a proper personal name in the Old Testament. The figure, the divine rebel of Genesis 3, does show up in the Old Testament. So you're really talking about a figure as opposed to a particular term used for that figure. Now, when we move into the intertestamental period, when we move into the New Testament, the term Satan gets drawn into Greek, means the adversary, and then it becomes used as a proper personal name for that rebel guy, that Nakash, serpent rebel, divine rebel figure in Genesis 3. So then it becomes a proper personal name, and that's the way it's been passed down to us in Christian tradition because of the New Testament shift to using that particular term as a proper personal name. It's the same character. And the reason why Jews of the Second Temple period and the New Testament Christians began to use it as a proper personal name is because the meaning of the term fits. It means opposer, adversary. Well, if the shoe fits, let's make him wear it. So it became a popular term in the literature and in general discourse at those later times, but it wasn't during the Israelite period. So having said all that, the whole thing about evil, God can judge evil when and how God wants to. If God wants to judge wickedness by the destruction of life, God is perfectly allowed to do that. God is also omniscient, so he knows if people in their heart of hearts are going to repent or not. God gets to make these choices. This is God's job description. When does wickedness reach the point where I am going to judge it? God makes those decisions. He judges in whatever way he wants to. And that's God's prerogative. I don't know that the question is, why do we have evil? That's a different thing. That's related back to something I discuss in a couple chapters in Unseen Realm. That relates to God sharing his attribute of freedom, free will, with both humans and divine beings. God did that knowing that there would be failure, knowing that there would be rebellion, knowing that there would be evil. God wasn't surprised by any of this. But the alternative is to not create humans at all. The alternative is to not create anyone, in the heavenly realm at all. And God deemed that not preferable. In other words, there's evil because God decided to create humans. God wanted humans, badly enough that he was willing to take that risk, essentially risk from our perspective, not from his, because he knew it was going to happen. But he knows that even though I'm sharing this attribute of freedom with you, you're not me. We lack God's nature. Intelligent divine beings lack God's nature. They aren't God. So we abuse, the good gift of God, the freedom that we have, and that's why there's evil. But the only alternative is to get rid of us, and God loves us. He is not willing to do that. He wasn't willing in Eden to do that. He's not willing now to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Heiser. We're down to the last 4 minutes. So right now, if you're on the Sixth Stream Cell Network line, it's *1. And I just want to let everyone know, Dr. Heiser, all of his books are available at his website at drmfh.com. Or, of course, I'm sure they're available on Amazon. Your book's not available on Amazon? Yeah.
Oh, no, that's the main. The links on my site will take you to Amazon.
Okay. So, yeah, you can go on Amazon and get a copy of The Unseen Realm or the Q&A companion to The Unseen Realm. Probably get both. He also has what the Bible teaches about the unseen world and why it matters, Supernatural. And there's a study guide book with that also. And he has the 60-Second Scholar, 100 Maxims for Mastering Bible Study. And he also has the 60-Second Scholar, 100 Observations on Bible Doctrine. And the 60-Second Scholar, 100 Insights that Illumine the Bible. And he also has another book called I Dare You Not to Bore Me with the Bible. So that's an interesting title there. So if you're interested in any of these topics, including, you have 2 fictional works, Dr. Heiser.
Yeah, I have 2 novels, The Facade and The Portent. The Portent is the sequel to The Facade. And they're science fiction. They're paranormal theological thrillers. And I like to piggyback theology onto fiction to get people who maybe aren't into the Bible or aren't Christians, to get them to the table, for the conversation through fiction.
Great. Well, so you can get either of his fictional works and also the other books at drmfh.com. Subscribe to the Naked Bible podcast. It's really, really a great podcast. I've been listening to it. He's going through the book of Ezekiel. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to the other subjects, but apparently I had a feeling this particular subject was going to really be meaty for us because of the listening audience. And also I had a ton of questions to ask about it. I really appreciate you coming on here. I know that you're a really, really busy guy. Maybe sometime in the future we can get you on about Sitchin and
sure.
and UFO cults and Nibiru and all of that.
Sure.
Because I've been following and I continue to follow the Nibiru followers since 2008, and it's really interesting. All the different spins that are on the page. So that's just a little side topic that I'm really, really interested in and that you hit on, especially.
Let me know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me know. We can do something in 2017.
Yeah, absolutely. 2017, we'll definitely work on that. And could you please definitely email me those references for those 2 books that you I think it was the 2 Powers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
Well, I'll definitely go ahead and look into those two books. I'm definitely going to put them on my Christmas list. And thank you so much, Dr. Heiser, for coming on doing it. I just want to let everybody know. Thank you. You can still follow the Sitchin Cell Network. I think it comes on at 5 or 5:30 today. And that will be 712-432-8710. 432-8710. You can listen to this program and others at our archives at www.blogtalkradio.com/HealingX Outreach and subscribe to us on iTunes. So you all have a blessed weekend, and thank you so much for listening to today's program here on Healing X Outreach. Let's please pray for Jehovah's Witnesses and those trapped in the cults. Bye-bye.